Cherry Brandy by Varlam Shalamov. The poet was dying. His big hands, swollen by starvation, with their bloodless white fingers and dirty, overgrown, curling nails, lay exposed on his chest, despite the cold. Before then, he had held them against his naked body, but that body now had too little warmth. His gloves had been stolen a long time ago. Stealing was just a matter of shamelessness, and thieves operated in broad daylight. The dim electric light bulb, covered in fly droppings and caged in by a round grid, was fixed high up near the ceiling. The light fell on the poet's feet. He was lying as if in a box in the dark depths of the lower row of a continuous row of two-story bunks. From time to time, his fingers moved and clicked like castanets as they felt for a button, a loop, a hole in his jacket, or brushed away a bit of dirt before stopping again. The poet was taking so long to die that he had stopped understanding that he was dying. Occasionally, some simple, powerful thought would force its morbid and almost palpable way through his brain, that the bread he'd put under his head had been stolen, and this terrible thought burned him so much that he wanted to quarrel, curse, fight, search, argue, but he didn't have the strength for any of that, and the thought of his bread died away. At the moment, he was thinking of something else, that everyone was going to be taken over the sea, that the ship was delayed, and it was lucky he was here. And he had the same light, fleeting thought about the big birthmark on the face of the barracks orderly. For most of the past 24 hours, he had been thinking of the events of his life. The visions he was seeing were not those of childhood, youth, or his prime. All his life, he had been in a hurry to get somewhere. What was wonderful was that now he didn't have to hurry, that he could think slowly, and he thought at leisure of the great monotony of deathbed movements, something that doctors had understood and described long before artists and poets. The features of Hippocrates, a man's death mask, are familiar to every medical student. This mysterious monotony of deathbed movements provoked Freud's most daring hypotheses. Monotony and repetition are the essential bases of science. What is unique about death was sought by poets, not by doctors. It was pleasant to be aware that he could still think. He had long been used to the nausea of hunger, and everything was of equal status. Hippocrates, the orderly with the birthmark, and his own dirty fingernails. Life was ebbing and flowing in him. He was dying, but life kept reappearing. His eyes would open, thoughts would emerge, only desires failed to appear. He had long been living in a world where people often have to be brought back to life by artificial respiration, glucose, camphor, caffeine. The dead became the living again, and why not? He believed in immortality, in real human immortality. He had often thought there were simply no biological reasons why man shouldn't live forever. Old age is merely a curable disease, and if it weren't for this still unsolved, tragic misunderstanding, he could live forever. Or at least until he was tired of life, and he hadn't tired of life at all. Even now in this transit barracks, the Transitska, as its inhabitants lovingly called it, this transit camp was the antechamber to horror, but it wasn't horror itself. On the contrary, there was a living spirit of freedom here, and everyone could sense that. The camps were yet to come. The prisons were in the past. This was peace on the way there, and the poet understood that. There was another path to immortality, as set out by Tuchichev. Blessed is he who visits this world in its most faithful moments. There was another path to immortality, as set out by Tuchikev. Blessed is he who visits this world in its most fateful moments. But if he was apparently not fated to be immortal, in his human form as a physical entity, at least he had earned creative immortality. He had been named the greatest Russian poet of the 20th century, and he often thought that this was true. He believed in the immortality of his poetry. He had no pupils, but do poets put up with pupils? He had written prose too. Bad prose. And he had written articles, but only in verse had he found things that were new to poetry and important, as he had always thought. His entire past life was literature, books, fairy tales, dreams, and only this present day was real life. All of these thoughts took place not as a dispute, but secretly, deep down in his inner self. He didn't have enough passion for such reflections. Indifference had long taken possession of him. How trivial it all was, like mice scrabbling about compared with the unkind weight of life. He was amazed at himself. How could he be thinking like this about verses when everything had been decided, and he knew it all very well, better than anyone? Who needed him here, and who cared? But why did all this have to be understood? And he waited, then he understood. At the moments when his life flowed back to his body and his half-open glazed eyes suddenly began to see, his eyelids quivered and his fingers fidgeted, then he was revisited by thoughts he didn't think were his last ones. Life entered, unmasked, like a self-confident lady of the house. He hadn't invited it, but it still came into his body, his brain, coming like verses, like inspiration. And the meaning of that word was for the first time revealed to him in its full sense. Verses were the life-giving force keeping him alive. That was it. He didn't live for poetry, he lived by it. It was now so obvious, so palpably clear that inspiration was the same as life. On the verge of death, he was allowed to learn that life was inspiration alone. And he was glad that he had been allowed to learn this final truth. Everything, the whole world, was comparable to verse, work, the sound of horse hooves, a house, a bird, a rock, love. All of life easily found its way into verse and settled there comfortably, and that was how it should be, for verses were the word. Even now, stanzas arose easily, one after the other, and although he hadn't written down any for a long time and couldn't write down his verse, the words still came without effort, in a rhythm that was predetermined and on every occasion unusual. Rhyme was a search tool, an instrument for the magnetic search of words and concepts. Each word was part of the world, it responded to rhyme, and the whole world rushed past with the speed of some electronic machine. Everything cried out, "Take me, no me!" You never had to look for anything. You had only to reject. There seemed to be two people here, the one who composes, who has got the wheel spinning at top speed, and the other one who makes his choice and from time to time stops the machine. The first one has set in motion. Having seen that he was two people, the poet realized that he was now composing real poetry. What did it matter that it wasn't written down? Writing down and printing was just vanity of vanities. The best was the unrecorded, what vanished after it was composed, what melted away without a trace. Only the creative joy that he felt, and which could not be mistaken for anything else, proved that the poem had been created, that something fine had been created. Could he be mistaken? Was his creative joy infallible? He remembered how bad, how poetically feeble were Alexander Blok's last poems, and that Blok apparently was not aware of the fact. The poet forced himself to pause. Pausing was easier to do here than anywhere in Leningrad or Moscow. At this point, he suddenly realized he hadn't thought about anything. For some time, life was again ebbing away. For long hours, he lay motionless. Then he suddenly saw before him something like a rifle target or a geological map. Whatever it was mute, and his efforts to understand what it represented were fruitless. Quite a lot of time passed before he worked out what he was looking at his own fingers. The tips of his fingers had brown traces of cheap cigarettes that had been smoked, then sucked to the very end. The pads had marked diactoscopic pattern, like a relief map of a mountain. All 10 digits had the same pattern of concentric circles, like tree rims on a log. He recalled once upon a time in childhood being stopped on the boulevard by a Chinese laundryman who worked in a laundry in the basement of the house where he grew up. The Chinese man casually took one hand, then the other hand, turned his palms up and excitedly shouted something in Chinese. It turned out that he was announcing that the boy was fortunate and had the marks to prove it. The poet very often recalled this mark of good fortune, especially when he had printed his first book. Now he remembered the Chinese man without any bad feelings or irony. He didn't care one way or the other. The main thing was, he wasn't dead yet. Actually, what did it mean to say died as a poet? There had to be something childlike and naive about such a death. Or was there something pre-planned, theatrical about it, like Yestnian's or Mayakovsky's death? Died as an actor, that made sense. But died as a poet? Yes, he had been some inkling of what lay ahead for him. The transit camp had given him time to understand and guess a lot of things. And he was glad, quietly glad of his feeble state, and he hoped he would die. He remembered a prison argument from some way back. What's worse, more frightful, camp or prison? Nobody knew anything for real. The arguments were speculative, and how cruel was the smile of a man who had been brought to that prison from a camp. The poet never forgot that man's smile, so much so that he was afraid to recall it. Think how neatly he'd trick the people who brought him here if he died now. He'd cheat them of a whole 10 years. A few years ago, he'd been in exile, and then he knew he had been permanently put on a special list. Permanently? The scales had changed. The words had acquired new meaning. He felt another flow of strength starting, like an incoming sea tide. High tide for several hours, then low tide. But the sea does not retreat from us forever. He could still recover. Suddenly he felt hungry, but he didn't have the strength to move. Slowly and with difficulty, he recalled that today he had given his soup to his neighbor. that a mug of boiled water was all the nourishment he had taken over the past 24 hours. Apart from bread, of course, but the bread had been issued a very, very long time ago, and yesterday's bread had been stolen. Someone still had the strength to steal. So he lay, at ease, and without thoughts until morning came. The electric light became just a little more yellow. They brought bread on big plywood trays, as they did every day. But he was no longer anxious. He didn't bother trying to spot a crusty piece. He didn't weep if someone else got that crust. His quivering fingers didn't stuff the make-wheat piece of bread into his mouth, and it instantly melted away in his mouth, and his whole being could sense the taste and smell of fresh rye bread. That make-wheat piece was no longer in his mouth, even though he hadn't had time to swallow anything or even move his jaw. A piece of bread had melted away, vanished, and that was a miracle, one of many miracles here. No, he wasn't anxious for now, but when they put his day's ration into his hands, he clutched it with his bloodless fingers and pressed the bread to his mouth. He bit the bread with his scurvy-ridden teeth. His gums began to bleed and his teeth rocked, but he felt no pain. He pressed the bread to his mouth with all his strength, sucking, tearing, and gnawing it. His neighbors tried to stop him. "Don't eat it all, it's better to eat it later. And the poet understood. He opened his eyes wide, his fingers not letting go of the blood-stained bread. "What do you mean later?" he pronounced precisely and clearly. Then he closed his eyes. By evening he was dead. But they wrote him off 2 days later. His enterprising neighbors managed to get a dead man's bread for 2 days. When it was distributed, the dead man's head rose up like a puppet's. Therefore he died earlier than the date of his death. Quite an important detail for his future biographers. 1958.